The Florida Legislature has started to move a bill that would essentially be a gift for the largest landowners in Florida, a bill that would essentially strip local government officials, local elected officials, and local residents in cities and counties around the state of any ability to have input on mega development projects on giant parcels of land of 10,000 acres and up. This is a real estate development bill unlike any we have ever seen come through Tallahassee. We'll tell you more all about it in just a sec. Hello and welcome to Seeking Rents, the podcast. I'm your host, Jason Garcia. I am the publisher of Seeking Rents, which is a newsletter in Florida about state politics, but with a particular focus on the ways that big businesses and other special interests influence public policy in this state. That name, Seeking Rents, if you're curious, comes from a term in economics called rent seeking. And rent seeking is what's happening when somebody with lots of wealth and influence, like a big business or a billionaire, uses their wealth and influence to get laws changed in their favor in a way that allows them to capture even more wealth and influence for themselves, usually at the expense of someone else. So we have just wrapped up here in Florida the final week of essentially preliminary committee hearings ahead of the Florida Legislature's 2026 legislative session. I am recording this podcast on December 13th, which is exactly 1 month out from the start of the 2026 session, January 13th, which is, at least in theory, should last for 60 days. And as a reminder, the legislature must be in session in order to pass bills into law or to pass them onto the governor, who can then decide to sign, veto, and whatnot. So I thought it would be worth recording a quick podcast to talk a little bit about the final week of committee meetings. And in particular, I wanted to focus on one bill that I think is especially worth flagging for folks, because I get the sense this is going to be one of the big lobbying pushes during the session from the development industry and from some of the biggest landowners in Florida. And that bill is House Bill 299, which began moving last week. Again, sort of began moving ahead of the start of session, which is often one clue that a piece of legislation has legs, as it were. And this is a bill. The title of this bill is an act relating to blue ribbon projects, which is like, who wouldn't oppose that? I mean, that sounds great, right? If it's got a blue ribbon, it must be good, right? Except this is a real estate development bill unlike anything I have ever seen. And so here's the way it would work. This bill would apply specifically to parcels of land of at least 10,000 acres or more that are all owned by the same landowner. So you're talking about just giant landowners. And it would allow people that own these giant pieces of property or have stitched together these giant pieces of property to qualify for essentially automatic development entitlements on those land, bypassing like local hearings and local votes from your city council or county commission, and bypassing opportunities for people in the community to actually have some sort of input on these decisions. And specifically what it would do is, if a landowner, if an owner of one of these 10,000 acre and up properties agreed to set 60% of that land aside in what are called quote unquote reserve areas, and we'll come back to that point in just a sec, but if they set aside 60% of the land, they then qualify for what is called administrative approval on the rest of the land, on the other 40%, the other 4,000 plus acres, depending on the size of the land. That would entitle them, doesn't matter what the current use of the property is, what the current zoning is, what the current future land use map plan, whatever the current plan, the local government could not require a rezoning, could not require a comp plan amendment. You would get automatic approval to build up to a certain density. I think it's of up to 12 units per acre or something like that. You're talking about 4,000 acres of land or more, right? And what administrative approval means is there is no public hearing on that. There is no, you think of votes on these sort of mega development projects. There's usually like a big showdown vote before the county commission or city council. That goes away. There is no vote. There is no public hearing. It just automatically happens. And so what this would do is it would take a landowner with a giant parcel of land and suddenly, as I said earlier, give it automatically entitle it to development rights. It just immediately raises the value of the land astronomically just by no longer having to sort of go through a county commission or a city council. This is This is like a preemption on another one of these preemptions on stairs. I can't even think of how many times on this podcast we have talked about the issue of preemptions, and which is when state government steps in and takes power away from local governments and takes away their ability to, regulate everything from like fertilizer use to the wages and benefits that employers in a region must pay. They step in. It's almost always, not always, but almost always, it's done by a big business interest group or business or industry group lobbying the legislature to strip some local regulation that they don't like and make sure no other community can do something similar. And when you think about it, land use planning is basically the main thing that local governments do in Florida, ensuring sort of development follows a predictable path, that you sort of like people know what to expect and what is coming down the future, setting these comprehensive plans and these future land use maps. That's like the main thing cities and counties do. And this is essentially obliterating that. It's just revoking that ability entirely in the case of these mega development projects. And so during the hearing, this was the first hearing on the bill, so it's the first chance we got to learn a little bit about it. But the sponsor of the House bill who is a Republican representative from the Southwest Florida, Lauren Mello, who is running for, I believe she's running for a seat in the state Senate now. She kept framing this in a bill as like an incentive, like we are trying to incentivize the state's biggest landowners to set aside their land for conservation. The problem here is that's just bullshit by the plain terms of the bill, right? Like this reserve area, I mentioned it says you got to set 60% of the land aside in reserve areas, but the conditions around this are like laughably weak. There's no requirement that the land be contiguous. There is no requirement that the land be set aside in perpetual conservation easements. It would allow, reserve area could include land being used for utility easements, for utility infrastructure. It could include land being used for golf courses. It could include land being used for retention ponds, conceivably. It is just the idea that what we're getting here is in exchange for giving you automatic development entitlement rights on a giant piece of land, that we're getting even more conservation land, just simply is not true by the plain terms of this bill. And the thing is, even if they start to tighten some of that stuff up, you get to the point like you still can't justify taking away all the ability of a local community to make. I mean, I should say, it seems to me like I don't understand how you can rationalize taking away the ability of a community to weigh in on these sorts of stuff. These are projects that will like fundamentally alter like communities. That's not to say they shouldn't happen, but the idea that you will silence people, you will actively take steps to prevent people who live in these communities from having any sort of input or leverage over the process is, this, among other things, this seems like a high potential to a bill to blow up in people's faces when people learn about it, if it does pass. And as I said, I do think this has got a lot of legs this session. So not only is this bill already moving now, so and usually when you see bills start to move during committee meetings before session even begins, it is often, not always, but often a sign that someone in that chamber's leadership is really interested in that bill passing. Not only that, though, there have been other clues. So for instance, earlier this fall, I should say, some entity called the Big Lands Transect Collaborative LLC. I had never in my life heard of this. It appears to trace back to a New York investment firm, although we're still learning more about it. But this entity, the Big Lands Transect Collaborative firm, suddenly hired like half the lobbying corps in Tallahassee. I think they've got, at this point, they had nobody in September. Now they have like 19 lobbyists registered for that to represent them in the Florida Legislature, like one lobbyist for every 6 members of the state house sort of thing. And they were this was the first entity to disclose that it was lobbying on House Bill 299 once it filed. So we've got a lot of indication that that's where the push for this is coming from some entity that has signed up an awful lot of lobbyists to work this. Another clue that this is the subject of much discussion behind the scenes in the Capitol right now is, so the Senate version of this bill is Senate Bill 354. And this is it's sponsored by a guy in the Senate by the name of Stan McClain, a Republican from Ocala who's quite literally a developer lobbyist. And he has a bunch of pro-developer bills. And another one was being heard earlier in committee week. So this was like a couple of weeks ago. And that one had to do with if I'm going off memory and I don't remember the bill number, but I will throw a link into the show notes for anybody who's interested in learning more. But it had to do with creating administrative approval. So like, again, stripping away public hearings and public votes on what it called infill development parcels, except the definition of infill was actually like not infill. It was stuff like, it seemed very much like any kind of traditional sprawl could potentially qualify for this designation as infill property. It also made a bunch of significant changes to the issue of compatibility. And for those of you that aren't familiar, that one of the things that local governments will often evaluate a proposed development project for is compatibility with sort of the surrounding properties and parcels. And so, the easiest way to think about this is if you had like a residential subdivision, you might not approve, you might deny an application to build, a big garbage dump on the right next door because that's not compatible at that point. And so this other bill that Stan McLean has would essentially say that all residential uses are compatible with each other. It doesn't matter if you're talking about like, ranch style houses on large sprawling properties versus, like high-rise apartment buildings. These would all be compatible with each other, which means a local government could not use compatibility as a reason to deny or insist on changes to a development project, a residential project like that. So anyway, I say all this to say that bill was being heard, and I think it was in the Senate Community Affairs Committee. And just like out of the blue, one of the senators on that panel, Senator a guy by the name of Jason Pizzo, who used to be a Democrat. He was actually the Senate Democratic leader for like 10 minutes, it feels like, and then he has since left the Democratic Party and become, I think he's NPA now. But out of the blue in that hearing, says to Stan McLean, hey, you got another bill that I can't wait to vote for, and that one's Senate Bill 354. Just like, again, completely out of the blue, suddenly talking about this blue ribbon projects bill and looking forward to voting for it. Another sort of suggestion that there's quite a bit of lobbying activity happening behind the scenes. This bill, in public, the lobbying for it at this first stop came from two kind of front groups. One was the Florida Chamber of Commerce, the big business lobbying group that generally represents the interests of the largest companies of the state and is also one of the richest campaign contributors in all of Florida politics, and also Americans for Prosperity, the Koch brothers-backed advocacy group showed up there. So that was sort of interesting. But those were the only two people that had the courage to testify in public in favor of this, whereas you had then sort of a parade of essentially environmental groups and local government groups testifying against it. This was in I believe it was the House Intergovernmental Affairs Subcommittee. What a riveting committee name that is. And despite this kind of like testimony here, it passed by a pretty significant margin, 12-2. This was a bipartisan vote. There were at least a couple of Democrats that voted yes on the bill. Interesting, the two no votes were also bipartisan. There was one Democrat that voted no. I believe it was Rita Harris, a Democrat from Orlando, and then one Republican that voted no. I believe it was Kim Kendall, a Republican from the St. Augustine area, which is really interesting because as you start to sort of like map out who are the biggest landowners that potentially could be affected by this, you start to see there's a couple of names pop up in Northeast Florida, in St. Johns County, where St. Augustine is one of the places that's like a bright flashing red bulb as places that could be deeply impacted by this bill. So again, this bill is moving. Like I said, I expect this to be the subject of an intense amount of lobbying and discussion this session. So for if this is the sort of thing that interests you, this is a bill to get up to speed on quickly, to start reaching out to legislators, particularly the ones in your area, if it's something you care about one way or the other. I know this is a bill that I'll be digging more into, so look for more coverage on the newsletter as we go here. And I do want to say, I actually sort of struggle a little bit with some of these development bills because I am sympathetic to the argument that we do need to build more housing, right? Like that's a big part of the challenge, but it seems to me just so fundamentally obvious that the solution is not to continue building sprawling housing further and further out of city cores and stuff, like the places where you find these 10,000 acres, like you're talking about, like in Orlando. This is essentially the big Mormon property between that's essentially all the cattle ranch lands between between Orlando and Melbourne, where a company owned by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and Tavistock Development, one of the biggest developers in Central Florida, are working on like developing essentially the equivalent of a new city in between Orlando and the Space Coast, right? Like, that is not the kind of housing that what we need to be doing is building more dense development in urban areas, in urban cores, closer to urban cores. The idea, I mentioned that urban infill or residential infill stuff, we do really need to be working on encouraging more infill development, but actual infill, not just continual sprawl. And the heavy lifting, it seems to me, and I will freely admit I'm not a complete expert on this, is you got to really start getting at like restrictive zoning in urban established residential areas and start to allow more like mid-rise housing and stuff, the kind of stuff that like that's where you really start to attack affordability in a way that's the sort of fight, though, the Florida Legislature is uninterested in having, and it's one reason it's uninterested in having is that's not the housing that these giant landowners and the biggest housing developers like Lennar, they're the folks that have so much influence in Tallahassee. That's not the sort of housing they really care about. And so instead, you get legislators inveighing about NIMBYism and stuff like that, except all they are attacking on the NIMBY front is the sprawling stuff. They're not doing the heavy, impactful lifting around like dense infill urban development. So, but I say all this that I am sort of sympathetic to the idea that we don't want to. We do need to allow more housing. It's just the idea that you're gonna like solve that by like completely taking away from the ability of local residents to have any say in the most sprawling kind of development there is. These giant parcels of land, and you're gonna do it in a way that like doesn't even get you like high quality conservation land for forever, that like suddenly we're going to be calling golf courses and like power lines conservation land. Is just that this is laughable. But you know, I say laughable, it's also deadly serious. This is, like I said, I think this is going to be a really big fight this session. So one to pay attention to. Again, link to the bill will be in the show notes. We'll also throw a link into the first vote on it, so you could see if your legislator was on this committee, if they were, how they voted. Although if they're not, Rita Harris or Kim Kendall, they voted yes. So with that, the only other thing that I think is really worth talking about from this past week was Ron DeSantis unveiled his budget for the 2026-2027 fiscal year. And this is always kind of like a big event on like just sort of like the political reporting calendar, because the governor is required to present a recommended budget to the legislature. It is kind of one of these like silly things that should not matter in one sense, because it other than he is required to present a budget to the legislature, it's sort of meaningless after this. The legislature, there's nothing that like requires the legislature to listen to him. Oftentimes the legislature, the House, Senate, they go and pass their own bills, and those are the two that they use as like the basis for negotiating a final spending plan. The governor's budget is sort of like basically worth the paper it is printed on, sort of thing. But it is still very interesting as like a political document, in terms of like a governor will use it to sort of like reveal his or her priorities, to pick certain issues that they really want to push during the session. And then it becomes like kind of a milestone document in terms of, you know, if you're the sort of reporter that is interested in stories about like, is the governor doing well or badly? Whose political stock is up or down? Not the sort of reporting that typically interests me too terribly much, but you know, the governor's budget is a very valuable document for that, because you can sort of get the sense of whether or not the legislature is giving the governor what he or she wants. And I say all this because I think what was honestly most interesting about Ron DeSantis' latest and last recommended budget, is how little he really said about it. Normally, you would have lots of details about specific projects and policies, like, you know, obviously in the last few years before it all blew up in his face, Hope Florida was a big discussion point in a lot of his budget presentations. You know, he will make very clear like the things he wants from the legislature, and pick like issues that he wants to rally around. There was almost none of that. It was just a handful of top line numbers, mostly around like education, kind of bipartisan, like generally stuff that like most people support, like raising teacher pay and stuff like that. He did not really get into many specifics about stuff that like would in any way require any sort of heavy lift. And I think what that spoke to is, I don't want to overstate this, like the governor is always relevant as long as he's governor, but it does sort of speak to just how diminished a figure he is in state politics at this point. Like, I mean, you're very much in your lame duck status at this point as your final year in office, or I guess actually, I said this was his final budget, but as I'm thinking through, yeah, there'll actually be, no, this is his final budget. Yeah, sorry, I don't have notes while I'm doing this. I probably ought to. But anyway, he's very much into his lame duck period. Also, as we saw last year, the legislature has become a much more hostile place from, not completely, like there's lots of indications that the Senate is more aligned with the governor than it is with the House, that sort of thing. But, you know, this was very much the budget presentation of a guy who is more afraid of being seen as racking up political losses than a guy confident enough that he's going to get a bunch of wins. You know, there's no doubt budget stuff that he really cares about, that he's working behind the scenes, but lacks both the political capital and the political courage to put big flags in the ground at this point, which is sort of a commentary on the status of Ron DeSantis at this point in Florida politics, I think. Although again, it would be wrong to say he doesn't matter. He's still got a veto pen. There's going to be he's got plenty of own sort of levers of power he can still pull. But it was really interesting. This was a far different budget presentation than any I can think of in his tenure as governor. That said, he does actually produce a budget, and there are some interesting things in there. The two things I think I would flag that I do think will be big issues this session. The governor proposed another $20 million for the Schools of Hope program. That's the program the state has that subsidizes certain charter schools and gives them all sorts of administrative advantages, now including the ability to co-locate rent-free in existing public school buildings. He wants to increase funding for that program. He's proposed $20 million. I think that will be an interesting thing to watch. There's going to be, this is obviously, we've written a ton about this on the newsletter. I think we've talked about it a couple of times on the podcast. This has become just a giant statewide controversy as charter school operators are exploiting this new Schools of Hope law that was just passed this last session, and that was passed at the behest of a billionaire who has become the biggest individual donor in all of state politics. There's going to be a lot of discussion about that this year. I suspect the legislature is probably going to go along with this. They're going to try and put a bunch more money into this program, in part because they want to please this billionaire donor and the New York charter school network that he is supporting that wants to tap into these funds, the Success Academy. I also think one thing I'm watching for this session is a lot of the records we got out of the legislature after the last session about this Schools of Hope stuff showed that, like, Ken Griffin and Success Academy, among other things, in addition to just wanting more money into this program, which pays for things like construction costs and startup costs for like hiring teachers and supplies and stuff, they want essentially permanent subsidies for their schools. I believe the number was they want like up to an extra $5,000 per student per year. And so there's a big part of me that wonders if we're going to see some language around that related to the budget. That to my knowledge, that's not in the governor's budget this year, but I would bet a decent chunk of change that there is legislation circulating behind the scenes right now in the Capitol that would potentially dramatically expand the scope of the subsidies in the Schools of Hope program. Could be wrong. It's just something to watch this session. The other thing, the governor is going even bigger on New College of Florida, the liberal arts college in Sarasota that he essentially launched a hostile takeover of a few years ago and put Richard Corcoran in charge of $1 million salary for a school of, what was it, like 700 students at the time, and has become essentially like a works progress administration for Republican insiders and conservative activists. It is just like shocking when you see the number of people in the Ron DeSantis sphere who are now on the payroll of New College of Florida. He wants to throw, his new budget includes an extra $35 million for New College, which is just like an enormous amount of sum to just give as like essentially a lump sum on top of the base budget, which has grown astronomically since they've decided to try and make it into an explicitly conservative school. The Hillsdale College of the South, as people in the Ron DeSantis orbit had put it in the past. In addition to that, the governor is openly now pushing to strip the Sarasota Manatee campus of the University of South Florida, to take that away from USF and give it to New College to sort of grow that fiefdom even more. It speaks to just sort of how important to to the conservative education project, new colleges, and also how important it is to this continuing it to be this employment center for hangers-on and insiders who can't seem to hack it anywhere else. They need new college, and so the way you keep that, you got to keep that trough filled. And so one of the ways you do it is give it $35 million and even a bigger sort of sandbox to work with. So that will be another interesting one. I've gotten the sense from the legislature is there's mixed feelings. There are a lot of Republican legislators, because obviously Republicans are what matter in Tallahassee, where you got super majorities in the House and Senate. There are a lot of Republicans that are fully on board with sort of the heritage foundationification of Florida education, and new colleges is sort of like a central sort of beachhead in that effort. But there are a number of Republican legislators, too, that are also skeptical that this is anything more than a grift and have been resistant to the idea of taking assets away from essentially a real university like the University of South Florida and giving it to this sort of just a conservative works progress administration. So that will be an interesting thing to watch this session too. I genuinely have no real good feel for how that one's going to play out, but it will get a lot of attention, I think. So, okay, I've rambled on longer than I intended to, so I think we'll just leave it there. Like I said, we'll throw links to votes and bills and show notes. I'll throw a link to the governor's budget page where you can pull up his actual budget and some of the budget bills he's got too. As always, if you can, please make sure to click like or subscribe and leave a show rating or review. These are the sorts of things that help grow the show. And if you haven't already, please think about signing up for a subscription to the newsletter. Easiest way to find us is seekingrentsfl.com. That'll redirect you to the Substack link. Subscriptions are free. Nothing is behind a paywall. A subscription will make sure that all of our stories and podcasts are emailed straight to your inbox. There is an option to voluntarily pay for a subscription if you can afford one. If you've got the means and you value the work we're doing here, watching some of the special interests influencing state policy, please think about doing one of those paid subscriptions. The revenue we get from those are just incredibly important to helping us sort of continue to build on the work we're doing and keep everything free to everyone, so everybody has access to the same kind of information here. So with that, we'll leave it there, and we'll be back again very soon, I am sure. Take care.